I'll manage with the hour that I'm given. Kathy's laughing. Over with. And we forget that it's going to probably return in the next month or so, right? With another 9 months of being pounded again. But while it's here, we certainly do enjoy the weather. My name is Patrick Zierten. I'm the director at the Orchard Recovery Center over on Bowen Island. It's about a 20-minute ferry ride just outside of Horseshoe Bay. We're a small residential facility, and we primarily treat drug and alcohol addiction. Today I'm going to talk about actually a paradigm that we incorporate in our facility right now that I've really never had an opportunity to speak about to an audience before, so I'm really excited about having this opportunity. And now I got to figure out how to work this thing. There we go. One of my favorite authors, Thomas More, wrote this in his book, Care of the Soul. The great malady of the 20th century, implicated in all our troubles and affecting us individually and socially, is the loss of soul. When the soul is neglected, it does not go away. It appears symptomatically in obsessions, addictions, violence, and loss of meaning. Our temptation is to isolate these symptoms or to try to eradicate them one by one, but the root of the problem is that we have lost the wisdom about the soul, even our interest in it. And I believe that's a beautiful way to kind of set the tone for this presentation. As I mentioned, I have probably way too much information. I don't know, do you double tap in order to get this to move? Oh, just the space bar. There we go. What I'd like to talk about today, and I may not be able to cover each one of these topics in length, addiction as a spiritual malady, speak to it as what I think is the root cause. What is treatment versus what is recovery? Some historical treatment paradigms, the shortfalls of what I believe are the current treatment models, and then or the Orchard's, I should say, 6-phase recovery paradigm, and finally the treatment protocol that we use at the Orchard. Personal story. I am an alcoholic. I am in recovery. I picked up alcohol at the age of 15. I have absolutely no idea why I did that. It was almost 20 some odd years later that I found myself in a detox facility. I know today the reason why I picked up then is not the reason I was using at the end. During that period of time, at 95% of my using would be considered functional. I appeared to the outside world as if I was not addicted. I held a job, I had a family, I had a house, I had assets. And it was only in the later stages of my addiction that those all began to be eroded away. And I found myself in recovery, and so when I speak of this paradigm, I'm going to be speaking partially from my own personal experience and my own personal recovery, but also the fact that I've worked with alcoholics and addicts for the last 7 years in a variety of different facilities. And I also have done a numerous amount of research and education around addictions and recovery. Another one of my favorite authors, Gerald May, who wrote a book called Addiction and Grace, speaks to like this: after 20 years of listening to the yearnings of people's hearts, I am convinced that all human beings have an inborn desire for God. Whether we are consciously religious or not, this desire is our deepest longings, our most precious treasure. It gives us meaning. Carl Jung wrote to Bill W., craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of spiritual thirst for our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. Bill W., who was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, was in correspondence with Carl Jung because he was introduced to a fellow that spent a great deal of time with Carl Jung trying to get recovery. And he was heavily influenced by Carl Jung when he developed the program, the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dr. Scott Peck Speaks of addicts as people who yearn to go back to Eden, who want to reach paradise, reach heaven, reach home, more than most. They are desperate to regain that lost, warm, fuzzy sense of oneness with the rest of nature we used to have in Eden. It seems, by at least these authors' definition, there seems to be a drive within all human beings. I'm not here to dispute or argue what that drive is, whether it comes out of the survival instinct, whether it's God-given, whether it is a drive for meaning and purpose, or is it just the reality that we just wish to connect with other human beings, with ourselves, and with something higher than ourselves. Some people would term that as God. But I don't think it's deniable. Otherwise, we would still be living back in the trees with spears. I mean, when we look at our technological advances over the last, 2,000 years, something was there to drive that forward. I believe at the end of the day, that drive pushes some people into a wayward search for that spiritual union that Carl Jung talked about, and they find alcohol and drugs, the closest semblance to that, without going through the long-term process of the spiritual path. But I don't want to leave addiction just as that, because it is definitely, well, it's not definitely, but there's a lot of evidence that indicates that there is a genetic component, possibly to predisposition for alcohol or drug abuse. There's obviously, you got to take the family system into consideration. That's the most primal influence of the individual from the beginning. It's heavily influenced by the anxiety of that system and also the function of that system. Physical makeup. Some people metabolize alcohol and drugs differently than other people do. Temperament, are we highly sensitive? Are we highly offendable? Are we easy to adapt? Are we highly resilient? Social environment, obviously peers, family members, school, etc., influence whether or not someone becomes an addict. Trauma and abuse, as there's a lot of research today, indicates that trauma and abuse can be an underlying cause for the reason why someone begins to use alcohol or drugs as a coping mechanism. And of course, some existing mental health issues that are sitting out there. With the advent of the dual diagnosis push over the last 20 years, we begin to understand that there's a large population of dually diagnosed individuals in the addiction population. Whoops, I think I just skipped one there. I apologize. There we go. Excuse me.
Yeah, you always just press that one right there.
That's reverse?
No, that's forward.
Okay, great. These influences can create a misconception or an undeveloped view of self. Without self, one cannot intimately connect to others or a higher presence. This inability to connect creates in the human being anxiety, which propels them into looking for something, a coping mechanism in order to deal with that. Inner drive, this anxiety moves one to attach to behaviors, things, people that give that illusion of connection. The illusion of connection calms self. With that, and of course the drugs, the master of that illusion is alcohol and drugs. But that's, again, not where it ends with addiction. It's also influenced by the type of drug that's used. We look at some of our crack cocaine addicts in our facility, and they talk about their history with crack as being 6 months or a year at the latest. Crack is highly psychologically addictive and seems to take the individual down to their proverbial bottom much quicker than, let's say, alcohol. Length and frequency of use is also. I used alcohol probably addictively for 15 to 20 years before I was able to, before I became to grips with the fact that I was an alcoholic. Metabolism of the individual plays a huge influence on whether you become addicted or not. The older you get, the less likely you're able to metabolize it correctly, and the more likely you're going to cross that proverbial line called addiction. And of course, gender influences whether or not you'll become addicted to something. The metabolism in a woman is less than the metabolism of a man, and they have, when they begin their use, they have an ability to cross that addictive line a lot quicker than, let's say, a male would. But eventually, they do cross that line from the point where the individual was using for one reason till they cross another line where they're using for another reason. And there's a saying that axions that fire together wire together. And there's a lot of research today that indicates that there is a brain pattern that the individual hardwires for the use of drugs and alcohol. It's known. It's got a very linear, and it's also got a network brain pattern that is very well defined. Neurological chemistry habituates to the presence of influencing drugs. It actually changes the levels of serotonin and dopamine in the brain. Most addicts have a high level of dopamine, which is the giddy up and go sort of neurotransmitter in the human being. And it pretty much tells the addict to giddy up and go and get it. And where serotonin is the governor or the regulator that says, oh, I've had enough. And so most addicts seem to have a whole lot of giddy up and go and not a cap on it that says, oh, I've had enough. And when you're in that addictive cycle, continually chasing it, it's a revolving cycle constantly. So it's somewhere along that continuum of addiction, or substance abuse, I should say, you cross this magical line where it becomes a brain disorder. That is the presenting issue. It's a brain disorder. It no longer is the same reason the individual began to pick up as to why they're using today. From our perspective, or my perspective, that it means that the person can never use euphoric drugs safely ever again because they're hardwired for that addictive using process. So it's a little bit of a thing. You got inner drive, that God-given survival instinct, whatever you might want to call it, that is the logs. You've got a little anxiety that happens to be the fire. You throw a little bit of genetics in there, maybe a little family system, maybe you throw in some trauma and abuse, mental health issues. You stir in some of the spices, the frequency of the drug use, the types of drugs that you use, and voila, somewhere along the line, addiction comes out of that boiling pot. So if addiction is spiritual malady in nature, then what you need is a spiritual solution. And as in any human being, the spiritual drive is the only path that answers the need for connection, others, self, and the higher concept. It manifests itself in meaningful relationships, a sense of belonging, a oneness, a wholeness, a purpose or passion that one does. It sounds very much like Frankl, doesn't it? It's also through the possibility of identity, of self, through one's own narrative. In the particular case of the addict, it's through one's own suffering. And the last thing is it's forever. It's forever. It's till you die. That spiritual path goes on. Now, before we get into the paradigm, I want to explain to everyone what I believe treatment is versus recovery, because I think there are two different things here. Treatment is a short, intensive intervention in the person's addictive cycle. It's residential facilities. It's a facility like myself. It's outpatient facilities. It could be intensive counseling, but it's a brief, short intervention, usually constrained by a time limit, that deals with the immediate problem, and that's addiction. Recovery, though, begins or can begin with treatment, but becomes a lifelong process of continued abstinence. Continued abstinence from mood-altering drugs, becoming a contributing citizen in the community of humanity, and reconnection with others, self, and some sort of higher sense of presence, higher sense of value system, or God, if that's the terminology you wish to use. Going on, thinking about treatment facilities of the past, or those short-term interventions, what we see here is pre-1900. They usually dealt with alcoholics, and of course that was the primary addiction at that time. There was some opiate addiction back there, but primarily it was alcoholism. They dealt with by putting these people into sanitariums, not specifically designed for addiction, but for mental health issues. Sterilization was a common practice back in those days. Thank God I wasn't drinking then. Because they did see that there was some sort of anecdotal family multi-generational transmission. Magic potions and elixirs, which is interesting, they often treated alcohol abuse with opiates or opiate abuse with cocaine. So they often switch back and forth. Of course, that's what I meant there by the addictive drugs. There's lots of snake oil salesmen back in those days. But that was pretty much how they dealt with addiction. In the early 1900s to the 1960s, of course, the 1900s in North America particularly, the temperance movement began to evolve, and there was actually a prohibition in the United States, as you may be aware of, and that was a way to deal with the drunken problem, right? There were some residential treatment facilities that were specifically designed for drug addiction, but they were really just a sanitarium in a different dress. They had a lot of holistic attempts of treatment back in those days, drying out, taking walks, getting involved with nature. I mean, there was a sense back then that addiction was more than just stopping using. It began to seed itself as that if the individual was going to abstain from using drug and alcohols, that they needed something more than just stopping. And of course, in the 1930s, Alcoholics Anonymous evolved with two gentlemen, Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, and they developed they're the grandfather of the 12-step movement. To date, it's probably the most effective model for addictions recovery. In the 60s, we began to see a split in treatment approaches. There was what I call the confrontational model, and sometimes it's termed nicely as the therapeutic community, where there's a lot of confrontation directly to break down the individual's denial, increase their awareness through conflict, and get the individual to sort of comply versus understanding what's going on with them. They were generally addicts treating addicts. Somebody in recovery, he had a couple years, he built a little house, he put a few beds in there, and he started treating alcoholics and addicts. There's heavy use of narrative and community, because they did live in a communal situation, and there was often meetings or group process that involved storytelling, which again is hugely important, I think, in the spiritual development of the individual. There's a strong sense of belonging within that community that was very beneficial for long-term recovery, but there's also a very strong dogma attached to it. It was recovery, it was Attila the Hun recovery, okay? And in order to belong, you had to adhere to very rigid dogma, and primarily that dogma is around the 12 steps. Because most of these folks most of the therapists that were treating these alcoholics and addicts were alcoholics and addicts themselves and got recovery through the 12-step movement. Heavily into reward and punishments too. Is if you violated a particular rule, you were kicked out of the community. If you used, of course, you were ostracized from the community and kicked out. But there was also huge rewards in levels of being accepted and accolades for staying clean for long periods of time. And it was an effective model. I have no doubt about that, and I'll talk a little bit about the ineffectiveness in a little bit. But also in the 60s, another sort of line of treatments began to evolve, and the granddaddy of that one was Hazelden, which, interesting enough, was it was one of those recovering addicts treating another recovering addict, and they did it, and her name was Hazel, and they used to have their meetings in her den. And of course, out of that, over a period of time, developed the Minnesota model, which is heavily 12-step focused, but also begins to deal with the biosocial and psychological aspects of the disease, much more than the other model did. It was, at the time, as Hazelden has evolved, it's been driven primarily from physicians, academics, and somewhat more of the medical model, although there was still heavy influence by the old guard therapists, the old guard recovery therapists. Today, centers begin to incorporate or have begun to incorporate more family and spiritual counseling. I think they've begun to recognize the importance of the family system in influencing the advent of addiction. They also have begun to understand that there's got to be something to this spiritual component that they probably need to begin to address. It's interesting, if you're familiar with any of the literature out of Alcoholics Anonymous, the guys, that old stockbroker back in the 30s and that proctologist that couldn't keep a practice going to support himself, recognized at that level, at an anecdotal level, that spirituality was vital to the long-term recovery process. And it was not until the 80s that we began to see this evolve in the treatment centers outside of the 12-step model treatment centers. The centers became more medically and pharmacologically focused. That is again driven by the fact that technology has improved the pharmacological interventions today, and they can deal with a lot more symptoms than they ever did 60, 70 years ago. We began to see harm reduction initiatives starting here, and if anybody's in Vancouver, we're the harm reduction capital of the world. I think I went to the International Harm Reduction Conference in the world, and it was held here in Vancouver. So we like to think that we take a leadership role here in Vancouver in that area. But a lot of it was started to get to be quick fix initiatives and protocols. How do we get a guy in the front door? How do we get him fixed as quickly as possible and send them on their way? The modalities for this particular thing have been driven from the outside, I think. Politics, which I think drives the harm reduction initiatives here in Vancouver. Insurance companies, which were the first ones that dictated that treatment should be 28 days, which now in the United States, we're beginning to see them go to 21 days. And there's no research that indicates that 28 days is the appropriate amount of time. I was just talking with this gentleman earlier about this same thing, and he mentioned that it was probably because of the lunar calendar. The moon goes around and rejuvenates itself every 28 days. Why not have an alcoholic or an addict? And, that's the first logical argument I've ever heard for a 28-day program, because certainly the insurance companies driving it does not produce a logical argument for that. Competition began to rise. We began to see more and more centers coming up and looking for more and more competitive ways to be. So they marketed very specific types of programs for very specific types of needs in addiction recovery. The academia and medicines began to drive the treatment protocol more than the old guard recovery folks. I'm an academic. And I sometimes find myself in this gray area between my recovery self and my academic self, and trying to figure out what's an even balance. But often what comes into mind is, I went to a lot of school, paid a lot of money for that. I got to get some value out of that, right? So I'm pulled by two directions. Like, this is what they said in school, and this is what I feel intuitively. Because of my own personal recovery, how do I meld that? And I think it's very difficult for people that don't immerse themselves in the 12-step program, or academics or clinicians that don't immerse themselves in the 12-step program, to understand both sides of that continuum and constantly be pulled by that continuum. Where if you only understand the one side, then that's where you're going to sit and live. Just like the old guard recovery therapists, they only understand one side. That's where they sit and live. That's what they feel comfortable. Costs continually increased. Again, because the insurance companies required more medical staffing, the dispensing of pharmaceuticals required additional staff. It drove the cost of treatment up. There's a treatment center down in the United States that costs $65,000 a month. They have a waiting list. It's extremely expensive to get recovery, or treatment, I should say, in the United States. Hazelden's between $35,000 and $40,000. Betty Ford, $35,000 to $40,000. Crossroads, just had a hired an individual that just spent some time down in Crossroads, $35,000. It's getting very expensive to treat addiction. And of course, society influences treatment facilities. They want it eradicated now. My child is an addict. I want them off the streets. I want you to fix them. My husband's an addict. I want him to stay in his job. I want you to fix them. So it's heavily driven. Of course, what culturally, especially in Western civilization, what drives us but instant gratification? I need to fix. I need to fix now. Demand for instant and permanent results or redefining of objectives. And that's an interesting thing that we're beginning to see right now is redefining objectives. Is harm reduction a way towards abstinence, or is it the objective? I won't get into that debate today. But it is, the more we splinter our thoughts on what treatment should be about, the more splintered it will be. And the less likely that we'll have strategic or tactical interventions that get people into long-term recovery. The treatment center's responses, obviously, if the insurance companies are only going to pay for 21 days, guess what? I'm coming up with a 21-day program. You know, it's $65,000 down there in the United States. I'm going to, and the insurance company's only going to pay for part of that if it's only 21 days. I'll figure out a program for 21 days. Now, will it necessarily be driven by what I think is the right therapeutic process? No, this could be financially driven. Increased use of pharmacology. And again, and this is, I don't want, some of these statements that I'm making here, I know they're broad brushed. I don't want to infer that all facilities fall into these categories, but there is a significant increase in it. Anywhere I've gone, any facility I've seen 50 or so centers down in the United States. I've seen a number of centers here in Canada, and everywhere I go, there's an increase in pharmacology. An increase on an overuse of pharmacology. I'll talk about that in a second. There's obviously increased costs, staffing pharmacology, I talked about that. Liability that goes along with that. In the United States, one of the biggest reasons why the cost of treatment is so darn expensive is because to carry insurance for their doctors, is this me or is, am I relapsing here? Increase. We have a number of American clients that come from the United States because to escape some of that exorbitant costs. And our doctors here were really reluctant about treating American clients, and we went out to look for insurance to cover our doctors, and it was well in the six figures a year in order to insure our doctors. We were fortunately able to find someone that was a little less expensive, but I mean, that would have added another $150,000 on our costs. Well, the only thing I got to do is I got to transmit that down to my clients in order to pay for that. The other thing, in order to compensate for these increased costs, a lot of facilities have gotten bigger. If I'll pay for the cost by increasing my volume. Now, there's downsides to increasing volume. One of the things that I think you absolutely miss when you go too large is you miss the concept of community, which has really been the mainstay of recovery, is particularly in the 12-step side of things. Whoa, and then there was light. Thank you. Oh, that's better. Thank you. No, that's fine, God. Thank you very much. So they've offset through larger facilities, but I think by increasing to a larger facility, they have hurt the therapeutic process of recovery. It led to overstaffing of academics, medical professions. Again, they bring their own particular cost and specialty to the program. Like I mentioned to you before, my $60,000 that I spent on my degree, I want to get a payback on that, and of course my increase in my services are going to be reflected in my salary desires, right? Disdain for an old guard therapist, the old guy that had 25 years of recovery underneath his belt, and got clean through nuts and bolts. Did it just dim again? And the funny part is I didn't recognize it for about 5 seconds, did I? Focus programming, they're getting more and more focused on dual diagnose, trauma and abuse, cross addiction. These are not bad things, by the way. I don't want to imply that these are bad things. These are results, though, of what I spoke of before, where treatment has gone. The shortfalls of some of these current treatment models, basically only the rich or the poor can afford treatment anymore. Who's got $65,000 US in their pocket to go to the Renaissance Malibu? Who's got $35,000 for that matter in their pocket to go tend Hazelden? So you either got to be absolutely wealthy or absolutely poor. And I think that's a sad statement when we think about where we've come over the long haul. I'm sorry? Because then you can get assistance. Then you can get public assistance through either welfare or in Vancouver through ADS, Alcohol Drug Services, and then you can get in there. So, you know, you've got usually those types of facilities. You got a facility that attracts the higher end client, or you got the facilities that attract the lower end client. Our facility is one of the facilities that attracts a higher end client. Although we are relatively inexpensive compared to the United States, we are still rather expensive. It's still difficult to pay for. It's difficult to pay for treatment, and then it's not about the money so much about what you pay for it. It's about you got to take a month off or 50 days off of work, and you know, so it's the loss of income plus the payment of treatment that becomes difficult. It may not create the excitement for ongoing recovery. You know, I can almost guarantee you in my facility that when you enter, you'll stay clean, and when you leave, you won't use. I mean, for the time that you're there, I can guarantee abstinence. I think that sometimes develops an overconfidence with the client, particularly if you don't emphasize to them that this is the reason why you don't have those psychological cravings is because your brain knows you're not going to use here, that once you walk out the door, the cravings may reappear just as intense as they were 28, 42 days ago. So it's almost guaranteed. It's highly protected from the real world. They come in and suddenly they don't have the pressures from work, they don't have pressures from the family, they don't have the pressures from the significant others. I mean, it's easy to stay clean in treatment. It really is from what people or from what they're used to. There seems to be an overemphasis on dual diagnosis or dual disorders. They do exist. The addictive population has high preponderance of dual diagnosed patients. There's no doubt about it compared to the normal population. But not everybody is dually diagnosed. And often, many centers diagnose a dual disorder while they're in the middle of detox or experiencing post-acute withdrawal symptoms, which can often mask themselves as depression, anxiety disorders, etc. So, whoa! The heat's not, or the air conditioning's not working well in here, and the lights aren't working too well in here today. There seems to be less focus as addiction as the presenting order. As I mentioned, is the underlying reasons why the individual began to use is not the reason why they're using currently. They're using currently because they are addicted. They have a brain disorder. And often we don't understand that. We want to treat the underlying conditions thinking that the individual can go back to either abstinence or some sort of social using. I never wanted to socially use. If I'm truly honest with myself, I always wanted to use as much as I possibly could without negative consequences. So the mere fact that an alcoholic or an addict comes in and says, I want to learn to socially use, is a lie. We don't want the negative consequences of our using. That's the truth. So when they want to work with the underlying issues, which we do not work with in our facility, we do not work with the underlying issues in our facility, because that's an avenue for them to back to use as far as I'm concerned. And of course, many clinicians treat what they wish to, what they are trained to treat. We have an individual in our facility that has got her master's in counseling and her expertise is in trauma and abuse. And it's very difficult for her not to try and work with the trauma and abuse piece. She's always pulled with trying to work with the trauma and abuse where the presenting issue right now is addiction. And the solution to this right now in our treatment center is to stop and to stay stopped. Again, there's, I believe, an overuse of pharmacology, benzos. There's a ward in one of the facilities down, or a number of facilities, I should say, for detox, where they have individuals on benzos for up to 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 18 days is really critical when you're using a benzo. You know, research indicates after 18 days, you're going to be physiologically addicted to benzodiazepine. But they got a whole ward that puts clients on for 2 weeks. You know, if the person doesn't have the right body size and maybe their metabolism isn't right, there's a huge, they come out of detox addicted. It's not unusual. I've seen situations, I've heard of stories where facilities in the United States where they come out of detox and then they have a seizure 3 or 4 days later because they're detoxing off the benzos. I think there's an overprescription of sleep aids. Granted, every addict, sleep disturbance is always there. You know, if you're a cocaine addict, you sleep for 3 or 4 days. If you're an alcoholic, you can't get to sleep for 4 or 5 years. At least that's the way it was for me. And, you know, the body is so darn resilient. We should allow it the time and the grace for that body to restabilize itself. And by introducing sleep medication too early, again, I'm not advocating that we don't do this. I'm just saying that we need to be very careful around doing this, that you're just allowing the individual to rely on another substance in order to balance themselves or restabilize themselves. Premature prescribing antidepressants, chronic pain issues. That's another thing that we often run on. Many opiate addicts come in with real pain, and they got addicted to the prescription medication as a result of a severe injury generally. So how do you deal with those people when they leave? There really isn't a solid answer to that, although we use a lot of holistic interventions in that area, acupuncture being one, massage being another. We have a spa on the island that we utilize for chronic pain issues. But that's an issue that really still has not been resolved. What do you do for the real chronic pain people? There's not an inattention to aftercare. It's almost like there's an over-attention to aftercare. Many facilities that I've seen in the United States and even up here have an aftercare program that's like 4 or 5 pages long. And they've got a multitude of activities on there that you're supposed to do as soon as you leave here. And I think it overcomplicates the aftercare process. In our facility, there's one thing that I stress when they leave. Go to meetings, go to meetings, go to meetings. Because everything that we have taught you here will be repeated in a meeting. If that's the only thing you could do in that highly anxious state you are, is to get in that car, turn the key, and drive to a meeting, then you probably aren't going to use. Get to a meeting. The rest will come naturally. That inner drive that's within every human being will take over eventually with abstinence. That's what we have to be relying on. And we'll talk about that too when I talk about the 6-phase return to functionality. That inner drive will kick in if there is abstinence. And even if we do have a long-term aftercare, many of the facilities don't have programs provided for the needs of long-term recovery, the existential crunch, the return to functionality. There's not programs in place that they can go back to in order to seek help. It's overwhelming. I'm going to move on a little bit because I think I'm running out of time. I am. It's an intensive 24 schedule, 8 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. There is so much information that we give our clients that it's overwhelming. Confrontational models, as I've mentioned before, often creates compliance, and if you get compliance with a client, you will not get long-term commitment. Harm reduction models may create complacency and enable continued drug use, which, if that occurs, then there's going to be another ultimate bottom. But more importantly, I think it neglects the soul. It treats the symptom rather than the person. It neglects the dignity of enduring human suffering. The addicts got there because they're suffering. We should allow them the grace to learn something from that suffering without over-medicating, over-activifying, over activities, overwhelming them with information. Let them sit in it. Our program allows the person to sit in it, and they develop coping mechanisms just by learning to sit in it. Looks at a recovery as a linear event, and of course spiritual process is not a linear event. It doesn't go from point A to point B. It's non-linear. It changes as it changes, and we cannot, well, go past that. Doesn't pay enough attention to process of long-term recovery, that this thing that they've just gotten themselves into is forever. When I look at addiction, I look at a 6-phase recovery paradigm. The first piece, the very first piece, is abstinence and break the cycle of using. Second piece is to build awareness by breaking down the denial, or vice versa, breaking down the denial by building awareness around their malady. Then there's a period of time where the individual re-identifies, where they begin to announce themselves as recovering addicts. First off, they announce themselves as an addict. Then the next piece is, now I'm an addict and I'm in recovery. I'm no longer using. There's a re-identification process. You have to make sure that an individual has that re-identification process. There's a return to functionality. I'll get into each one of these. An existential questioning. And finally, at the end, the embracing of the mystery. As you can see, the abstinence is lifelong. It must be maintained at all times. In abstinence, I won't get into the definition of abstinence at this point, but I'm going to say it's not using drugs and alcohol at this point. There's a building of awareness that comes on early in the recovery process. There's a re-identification process, a return to functionality, and finally, later on down, questioning and embracing the mystery. Treatment, there is not much that we can do, nor should we expect to. I think that's the first thinking that we have to understand. There really is not much that we can do. We've only got 28 to 42 days. Yeah, granted, it seems like a lot of time, but in the scheme of a lifetime, it's a nanosecond. So what can we do with 28 to 42 days or 50 days or whatever your program happens to be? Let's be realistic about what we can do. What we do in our particular facility is we break the cycle. Obviously, when they come in, they stop using. We don't, just because you're an alcoholic, we do not let you smoke crack in your bedroom. Okay? We stop the house. There's a return to health. Usually a lot of folks come in there, they're pretty beat up. They lack nutritional value, so we get them back fed. They get themselves feeling better. We build awareness to break down the denial. That should be denial, not awareness. We create excitement for long-term recovery, and we maintain a very singular and sustained message through those 28 or 42 days that we have those clients. Breaking the cycle, medical detox, mild or moderate, rest, exercise, fresh and nutritional food, medical monitoring, alternative holistic healing. This all is part of breaking the cycle, return to physical health. When we talk about building awareness, breaking down the denial, we always meet the client where they're at. We are not confrontational by definition, but we do respectfully challenge their thinking. We process emotions when they're in the facility, but we do not try and stimulate it. We don't try and dig down deep. We don't rip the scab off of trauma and abuse while they're there for 28 or 42 days. It's too dangerous. It's unethical. Supervised group rather than individualized therapy. We believe that group process is far more effectual than individual therapy, because often what happens is in individual therapy, the client takes the therapist down the path they want to go, which is usually dealing with the fact that, their mama didn't love them, or their daddy didn't care, or I didn't get a pony when I was a kid or something. And so we find that supervised group is valuable. But it is not client-driven group. In many facilities, the client drives the group, where we have facilitated group. And we also provide a generic model that has a lot of leeway for the client to explore. It's not a very singular path. Yes?
Is it co-ed?
Yeah, our facility is co-ed. Yeah, and that's where a lot of that leeway goes. So we try and not that we design a very specific program for each individual, because I don't think that's possible, but we do allow some leeway in their programming to accommodate individual needs. We build awareness of the malady. We define addiction as a misdirection of inner desire for wholeness, a loss of soul, as a beginning point, but not a reason why you're using today. We define addiction as loss of connection to self, others, and higher value system. So we begin to plant the seeds that this thing's a lot longer than what you think it is. We definitely define addiction as a process rather than an event that somewhere along the line you decided to go into a cocktail lounge and immediately you came out addicted. It is something that happens a long time ago. That we talk about the physiological and neurological implications of addiction, and we talk a lot about family systems' influence on addiction, because in order to understand yourself, you got to understand how you operate within the context of your family and how your family operates in the context of the addict. During the re-identification phase, this is done still in treatment. The therapeutic community of recovering addicts is critical. That's what's going to sustain them, from my perspective, when they leave. That's what needs to be created when they are in recovery, or excuse me, in treatment. We introduce new rituals. There's rituals, if anybody's familiar with long-term community in the recovery side, there's rituals, there's narrative, there's storytelling, there's a sense of belonging. Many of our clients speak about the first time they've been in treatment, it's the most intimate experience they've ever had in their entire life, even with their significant others. They finally find a place that they belong, and we create hope. We use our staff and our alumni as role models. Not all of our staff are in recovery, but there's a significant portion of our staff that are in recovery. And we utilize their narratives, their stories as role models. Introduction to spiritual values, practices, and traditions. We try and give a lot of options for people to explore, but we centrally focus on the 12-step model as the model that they should embrace once they leave the facility. And of course, we introduced the 12-step communities, and we spent a lot of time talking about 12-step communities as a long-term support function for people in recovery. We introduce them to the vocabulary. We teach them how to get into a meeting, what to do and what not to do. We take them to meetings. Our meetings within the confine of the treatment center are all 12-step based. So when they walk out of that facility, they can walk into a 12-step meeting and not feel uncomfortable. I grew up in 12-step meetings. My first meeting was almost as bad as detox. Because I was terrified. And so we eliminate a lot of that and encourage them to continue on. Simple aftercare plan that focuses on recovery community, meetings. We also get them to get involved with an addiction doctor, and if there's some long-term underlying issues that need to be resolved, we set them up with a therapist for at least 6 months past they leave the treatment center. They do not get into counseling until at least 6 months after they leave the treatment center. Especially couple counseling. We have alumni services that encourage the recovering addict back home. We have alumni Thursdays, we have alumni reunions, we have a website, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of things that people come back for to celebrate their anniversary. Post-treatment, and this is like once they leave treatment. So now we've sent them on their way, we've got a good aftercare plan in place, we're sending them off to the 12-step community. And by the way, the only reason why we do send people off to support recovery, or the 12-step community, is because we believe that long-term recovery requires long-term support. And the 12-step model to date is pretty reliable. It's been working for about 70 years now. Lots of folks have stayed clean in that model. The other reason why we do it is because it's always available. I don't care where you go in North America. If I send somebody back to Prince George, or I send them back off to Nelson, BC, they'll be able to find a 12-step community. So it's availability plus the fact that it works, and of course I'm a little biased. But returning to functionality, which is the next phase that I think an alcoholic or an addict goes to. And what I mean by that is that's where you reconcile with other persons they have harmed, the recovery of loss of prestige, a recovery of material goods. It's staying abstinent, returning to functionality is the recovering's meaning and purpose at that time. It's getting back to where you were. It's finding the job. It's reconciling with the wife. It's taking the kids to the P&E. It's being a functioning citizen in society. It's maybe retraining for a new job. Maybe it's going back to school. But there's a period of time that every alcoholic and addict spends in trying to become functioning. Problem with that is that once they kind of get through that period of functionality and they have returned to be a viable citizen in society, they wake up and they go, is that all there is? There's got to be more than just staying sober one day at a time. I mean, if that's what it is, I might as well go back and drink. It's the inner drive, that spirit that I talked about in the beginning, starts to nudge at them at this point. You know, they've regained what they hope to accomplish. And now they've got to go on, like every human being at this point, every human being bumps up against this existential question. Now, you could choose to deny it, which a lot of folks do, and they use alcohol and drugs in order to do that, or they get busy with work, or they get busy with the kids, or whatever their behavior pattern is to avoid this question. They'll do that. But this is when it comes up. It usually comes in that third, fourth, fifth year. That's when it hit me, 2.5 years. I hit that existential question. I had to change. I quit work. I went and sat in Mexico for a while in the desert. I ended up going back to university, started working with alcoholics and addicts in recovery houses, and I dramatically changed my life. And you know, it was extremely frightening at that point because that involves change, and it no longer meant that I could do what I was used to doing. So, but I don't think any addict that gets to this point that doesn't do something dramatic will end up relapsing. And you'll see a lot of times in alcoholic conferences, Alcoholics Anonymous conferences, is they have these things called countdowns, if anybody's familiar with that, where the person stands up when they announce a particular length of sobriety, and you'll see people stand up at 20 and 15 and 10, and then all of a sudden around that 4 and 5, it drops off like a stone. And then you see an increase after that, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But it's really unusual. It's not based in solid statistics, but man, anecdotally, when you look at that room and you just see those, handful of folks stand up at 4, 5, and 6 years, you got to wonder, where did they all go? Where do they all go? I'd like to believe they're not using it, they just found a different spiritual path, but I don't think that's the reality. I don't think that's the reality. They've bumped up against this, and they haven't been able to do it. So again, the choice is complacency or change, as I mentioned. Many recovering people relapse at this time. I won't go into Bill W.'s example at this point because I think I'm running out of time. Treatment. I'm not sure what that was. Treatment facilities that can help in response to this existential crunch is you can have continued communication via websites, email, phone contacts, aftercare accountability groups, program availability, spiritual retreats. Please see our pamphlets at our desk. Counseling and spiritual direction for this time frame. And encourage clients to, number one, make sure that they understand you're going to bump up against this. It's going to happen. Give us a call in 3 years. When that happens, we've got something available for you. This is something that most treatment facilities do not have available because they after their 42 days, they send them on their way. Finally, at some point, it's embracing the mystery. You understand it's about the journey and not the end. Understanding it's about the search and not the finding. Understanding it's about how our lives are understood in the memories of others and not how they are perceived in us today. It's an understanding that we never figure it out and get comfortable with that fact. That we never figure it out and we get comfortable with that fact. And it's understanding that the addict's suffering has some value and meaning. And I'm going to talk about my own personal experience here. I'm already getting emotional because I'm about ready to talk about it. I had one of the most meaningful things that happened to me about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I got to call my youngest son, who's trying to manifest his dream of a child to be a firefighter. And I was able to tell him I can help him this time. 2 years ago, my 2 older children, I was not able to help them with that because I was in my addiction or recovering from the devastating destruction of that addiction. But that's what recovery is about, is that phone call. And if we don't understand that as clinicians and researchers, that it's not about the results at 42 days, it's not about the results at a year, it's about that phone call. And the alcoholic or the addict can call and be a functioning person in society. God bless. Thank you. We have 2 minutes. How'd I do? Any questions or thoughts, please? Yes? Yes, please.
How do you lead a team of people who come as staff with different perspectives and, as you said earlier, different focuses and training? And how do you unite them to believe in what it is you believe to deliver what it is you would like to deliver?
Well, that's a good question. I think that's where leadership comes involved, right? You have to have a leader that believes passionately about their approach, and that passion can be picked up by the people that they surround themselves with. It's selection too, right? Some folks just won't be able to cross that line, and maybe through attrition they fall away by the wayside. But you have to be patient, compassionate along the way, and tenacious. So, I don't know. And of course, they're human beings, and they depending on what's going on in their life, that kind of changes their focus at times, and they bring their own frustrations to work too. So, please.
Talk a little bit about treatment being an artificial environment and people heading out to a world waiting for them, and also the process of reconnecting when they do. I'm just wondering what sort of work or opportunities for your
Family program every Saturday, and once a month, every 28 days on a lunar calendar, we have an extended weekend where the families come for the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday kind of thing. And then we have a family aftercare program that we run every Wednesday, indefinitely. Because the toughest people to keep in recovery, which I didn't really speak a whole lot about here, is the family member. They once their crisis is gone, once, you're fixed, you're out of treatment, buddy, you get back to work, then their crisis is apparently gone, and they don't have the urgency or the motivation to continue their own process. But if you understand family systems, addiction doesn't happen in isolation. It definitely is influenced by the behaviors and the anxiety of the other people within that system. So yeah, they need to stay in recovery. Unfortunately, we have less success rate with family members staying in recovery than we do with the addicts. That's a sad statement when you think about the addiction recovery rate for addicts is so minuscule. It's that's the other thing about it. That 30% is just about all you'll get. Now, there might be some facilities out there touting other statistics, 50 or 60 or whatever. But, when you really kind of take away the fluff and the rough and why they make those claims, it's that 30%, man. It's been that way. AA used to claim 75%, but, they used to have an armed guard with them called a sponsor all the time. So that's unrealistic. But 25, 30%. So, and yet the drop-off with a significant other is even more. Please.
Do you know anything about using fasting?
Fasting? No. To be perfectly honest with you, I've never thought about fasting, although some of our clients have requested a detox, which isn't quite fasting. If you mean fasting as abstinence of all food, no, but we have had some people do some detoxes there where they do limit their food intake and they take some other supplements, not stimulants, And they report unbelievable results. I mean, they feel great. The problem is, as soon as they get done with the detox, they resume their old behaviors. So, whatever they've kind of gotten out of their system, within a week, they got them all back. So, yeah,
You gave wonderful historical overview of all this approach. But can you tell a few?
Singular in its message. Singular in its message. Recognizing that we can only deal with the addiction as a presenting issue with the time frame we've got. Those are probably the two main things. Singular in its message, recognizing that we've got. Also, in our facility, we step into the gray area quite often. We don't have real rigid dogma, and we allow the clients to kind of manage themselves within some wide parameters with that singular focus. Those are probably the three things that we do.
You mentioned here in this book, your approach is based on Biennial, Abraham Maslow, and Viktor Frankl.
Yes. Well, if you mentioned the Viktor Frankl piece is he understands the search for meaning. It's in the context of your suffering, what you do, and the relationships you have in life. And I'm a true believer of that. And I think as addicts and alcoholics, we have a unique suffering that we can draw a narrative from. So we're kind of a, I don't want to say the chosen few, but we have a unique suffering. So from with that, we have there. I don't know if who else did I mention in there?
Abraham Maslow.
Maslow, yes, the hierarchy of well, first of all, of course, we address the lower end of things. But a lot of times, a lot of facilities try and address the higher end of the triangle, and often talk about self-actualization when they're still trying to figure out about survival and safety. We're survival and safety. Abstinence is about survival and safety. You got to get clean in order to survive. You got to get clean in order to go to work. So we just stay really low on that end. Although long term, the objective is to go to the higher end of the triangle, right?
Introduce this idea for your clients.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But we really just deal with those first three down. That's all we deal with. I don't go any higher than that.
It was surprising for myself. I'm working in hospital.
Oh, okay.
In patient hospital.
Yes.
We have a lot of addicts for 7, 5 days, for 10 days. After we are sending them to programs like yours. And it was surprising for me when I learned what Abraham Maslow is very popular in hospital setting.
Yes.
Because of his basic needs.
Yes.
And just in nursing textbook, Abraham Maslow introduces
Right.
basic for psychiatric nursing. It's very interesting. And how do you use William White?
Oh, William White, he's a well-known, his thing is about the re-identification. You have the identity of the addict, which probably is just as addictive, or the individual is attached to that identity just as much as they are sometimes to the drug. It's the experience, the ritual, the culture that goes along with drug and alcohol addiction. And his idea is that you need to break down that identity and develop a new identity that the individual can attach to. Because if you stop the abstinence, but they still go back to the same culture, the same identity, they will use again. Okay? I beg your pardon?
How do you help to re-identify?
Through our own personal narratives, through community of these people getting better, and they begin to re-identify themselves. We always ask them to identify themselves. Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm a recovering addict. And I thought, please, Sally? I do. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should pass that out. Okay. Any questions? I think we are done. Wow. Thank you very much.